February 23, 1965. A Latvian aviator pulls his rental car to a stop outside a modest beach house in Carrasco, a quiet neighborhood on Montevideo's eastern edge, checking the address against notes provided by his Austrian business partner. Herberts Kukurs gathers papers from the passenger seat, documents outlining a proposed tourism venture that promises financial security and a new chapter in his comfortable South American exile. He walks toward the entrance, unaware that Mossad agents wait inside with a single purpose: execution for crimes committed 2 decades earlier in occupied Latvia. The meeting invitation came from Anton Quenzele, an entrepreneur who had cultivated Kukurs' trust over months of correspondence and meetings, proposing investments in boat rentals and tourism infrastructure across Uruguay's coastline. Kukurs had found the proposition attractive, the business plan credible, and Quenzele's Austrian credentials reassuring. Inside the beach house, Israeli intelligence officers prepared for an assassination that would bypass judicial process entirely, eliminating a man they considered beyond the reach of conventional extradition and trial. The killing will trigger international controversy, expose Mossad's willingness to execute war criminals without legal proceedings, and establish precedent for operations that prioritize retribution over courtroom justice. Herberts Kukurs represented more than just another Nazi war criminal living comfortably in South America. Before the German occupation of Latvia in 1941, he had achieved celebrity as one of the nation's most accomplished aviators, completing long-distance flights across Europe and Africa that earned him recognition as a national hero. Newspapers celebrated his technical skill and daring. The Latvian government awarded him honors, and young pilots studied his techniques. When Nazi forces arrived in Riga in July 1941, Kukurs possessed social capital that most Latvians lacked, connections and reputation that positioned him for collaboration rather than resistance. He joined the Uruguay Commando, a Latvian auxiliary police unit that operated under German SS supervision, conducting operations that transformed him from celebrated pilot to mass murderer. The Uruguay Commando participated in the systematic extermination of Latvia's Jewish population, executing approximately 30,000 people between 1941 and 1944. Kukurs did not merely follow orders from a distance. Survivor testimony documented his direct participation in massacres, including the Rumbula killings of November and December 1941, where nearly 25,000 Jews from the Riga ghetto were murdered in 2 days. Witnesses described him personally shooting victims, supervising execution pits, and displaying enthusiasm for violence that exceeded mere compliance with German directives. His hands-on involvement earned him the designation Butcher of Riga, a title that distinguished him from officers who commanded atrocities without participating directly. He represented the phenomenon of willing collaboration, individuals who embraced genocide not from coercion, but from ideological alignment or personal gain. After Germany's defeat, Kukurs escaped through networks that smuggled Nazi collaborators and war criminals to South America. He reached Brazil in 1946 using forged documents, settling in Sao Paulo where he operated boat rental businesses and maintained connections with other European refugees. By the early 1960s, he had relocated to Uruguay, continuing his boat rental enterprise while living under his real name, apparently confident that distance and time protected him from prosecution. He expressed no remorse for his wartime actions, telling acquaintances who inquired that he had fought against communism and defended European civilization. This psychological profile, a man who viewed mass murder as justified political action, made him particularly significant to Israeli intelligence officers tracking Nazi war criminals. The question facing Mossad was not whether Kukurs deserved punishment, but whether justice required a trial, or whether execution without judicial process served purposes that transcended conventional legal frameworks. For Israel, Nazi war criminals living freely in South America posed not just a moral affront, but a challenge to the nation's founding purpose as a refugee for Jewish survivors and a guarantor that genocide would face consequences. Thousands of Nazi collaborators and SS officers had escaped through rat lines established by sympathetic clergy, former intelligence networks, and South American officials willing to accept Europeans regardless of their wartime records. Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Chile harbored war criminals who adopted new identities, established businesses, and integrated into communities that asked few questions about European refugees arriving with cash and skills. Adolf Eichmann's capture in Buenos Aires in May 1960 demonstrated that even the most carefully hidden fugitives remained vulnerable to Israeli intelligence. Yet that operation also revealed the limitations facing Mossad. The Eichmann abduction had succeeded through patient surveillance, careful planning, and execution that minimized violence while securing a prisoner for trial. His 1961 prosecution in Jerusalem established legal precedent for holding Nazi war criminals accountable decades after their crimes, satisfying demands for public justice that exposed the Holocaust's scope to a global audience. Yet Eichmann had been captured, not killed, brought to Israel for judicial proceedings that lasted months and consumed significant resources. Not every target warranted such investment. Mossad faced competing priorities that forced difficult choices about resource allocation. Arab nations threatening Israel's existence demanded constant intelligence focus. Palestinian terrorist organizations required monitoring and disruption, and Soviet-aligned adversaries necessitated counterintelligence operations. Nazi hunting, while symbolically important, competed for limited personnel, funding, and political capital. International law complicated operations further. Most countries refused to extradite war criminals to Israel, claiming jurisdiction belonged to nations where crimes occurred or that suspects deserved trials in their countries of residence. West Germany prosecuted some former Nazis, but moved slowly and often imposed light sentences that outraged survivors. Diplomatic pressure rarely produced results, and legal channels frequently failed entirely. Mossad officers understood that conventional prosecution remained impossible for many targets, yet some war criminals possessed such significance that allowing them to live peacefully mocked the memory of victims and suggested that sufficient time could erase accountability for genocide. Mossad's Nazi hunting operations required systematic intelligence gathering that consumed years of effort and demanded difficult choices about which targets justified the risks. Officers stationed throughout Europe and South America compiled dossiers on suspected war criminals, tracking movements, identities, and activities through networks that included Holocaust survivors, Jewish community organizations, and sympathetic informants willing to report sightings of Europeans whose backgrounds seemed suspicious. This information flowed to documentation centers in Israel and Europe, where analysts cross-referenced testimony from concentration camp survivors, captured German military records, and evidence collected during post-war trials. The process identified hundreds of potential targets, most of whom would never face prosecution or punishment because they lived in countries that refused extradition, had adopted identities too secure to penetrate, or simply lacked sufficient documentation to prove their crimes beyond reasonable doubt. Prioritization criteria balanced multiple factors. Severity of crimes mattered, with individuals responsible for mass killings ranking higher than those who committed lesser offenses. Symbolic value played a role. Prominent figures whose capture or elimination would generate publicity and demonstrate Israeli resolve received consideration beyond their individual culpability. Operational feasibility determined which targets could actually be reached. Officers stationed in countries with strong security services or living under protection proved nearly impossible to approach. Resource constraints forced brutal calculus about which operations warranted investment. Each mission required personnel, funding, safe houses, forged documents, and coordination that diverted resources from other intelligence priorities. The decision between capture and elimination reflected both practical and philosophical considerations. Eichmann's trial had provided educational value, exposing Holocaust details to generations unfamiliar with genocide's scope. Public proceedings offered closure to survivors who testified and witnessed justice administered through legal process. Yet trials required successfully transporting prisoners to Israel, maintaining custody during months of preparation, and accepting international criticism of kidnapping sovereign nations' residents. Execution avoided these complications while achieving permanent removal of targets who might otherwise evade justice indefinitely. Mossad Special Operations Division, responsible for actions beyond conventional intelligence gathering, developed protocols for both approaches, selecting methods based on target significance, location, and broader strategic objectives. Survivor testimony drove much of this targeting work. Holocaust survivors living in Israel and abroad provided crucial intelligence, identifying perpetrators they had seen committing atrocities, recognizing former guards or officers now living under assumed names, and documenting crimes that official records failed to capture. These witnesses often dedicated decades to tracking specific war criminals, maintaining correspondence with other survivors, sharing photographs, and alerting authorities when they discovered fugitives. Their persistence supplied Mossad with leads that professional intelligence gathering might miss. Personal vendettas transformed into operational intelligence that filled gaps in official documentation. By 1964, Herbert's Kukurs had emerged as a prime candidate, his crimes documented extensively through survivor testimony, his location in Uruguay confirmed through surveillance, and his routine predictable enough to permit operational planning. Herbert's Kukurs was not an obvious candidate for obscurity. Born in 1900 in Latvia, he had built a reputation during the 1930s as one of Europe's most accomplished aviators, completing solo flights from Riga to Gambia and Tokyo that earned international recognition. The Latvian government celebrated him as a national hero. Newspapers chronicled his achievements, and aviation enthusiasts studied his long-distance flight techniques. His pre-war celebrity gave him social standing that most Latvians could not claim, connections that positioned him for influence when German forces occupied the country in July 1941. The Nazi occupation transformed him from aviator to executioner. Kukurs joined the Arise Commando voluntarily, a Latvian auxiliary police unit commanded by Viktors Arise under German SS supervision. The unit conducted anti-Jewish operations across Latvia, participating in massacres that killed tens of thousands. Survivor testimony placed Kukurs at the Rumbula Forest in November and December 1941, where approximately 25,000 Jews from the Riga ghetto were murdered over 2 days. Witnesses described him personally shooting victims, supervising execution details, and displaying eagerness that suggested ideological commitment rather than reluctant obedience to German orders. His direct participation distinguished him from officers who commanded from distance. Germany's collapse in 1945 triggered his escape through networks smuggling war criminals to South America. He reached Brazil in 1946, settling in Sao Paulo, where he operated boat rental businesses while maintaining contact with other European refugees. By the early 1960s, he had relocated to Uruguay, establishing similar enterprises in Montevideo, and apparently confident that geographic distance and elapsed time protected him from prosecution. He lived openly under his real name, discussed his wartime service when asked, and expressed no remorse for actions he characterized as defending civilization against communism. These personal circumstances, seemingly stable and secure, created the vulnerability that Mossad would eventually exploit. The operation began with the creation of Anton Quenzele, a fictitious Austrian businessman whose legend Mossad constructed with meticulous attention to verifiable details. The identity included business registration documents in Vienna, banking references that could withstand superficial investigation, and a plausible backstory involving tourism investments across South America. Mossad selected an agent fluent in German with sufficient business knowledge to maintain the cover through extended interactions, someone capable of presenting credible proposals while concealing his actual purpose. The agent traveled to Brazil in late 1964, establishing a presence that allowed natural contact with European expatriates, including Cookers. Initial approach came through shared business circles, conversations at gatherings where European refugees discussed commercial opportunities and reminisced about pre-war lives. Quenzele expressed interest in boat rental operations, mentioning plans to expand tourism infrastructure along Uruguay's Atlantic coast. He asked Cookers about his experience operating similar businesses, soliciting advice that flattered the Latvian's expertise while establishing rapport. Subsequent meetings developed the relationship further, with Quenzele proposing a partnership that would combine his Austrian capital with Cookers' operational knowledge. The proposal appeared professionally sound, offering profit potential without requiring Cookers to risk significant personal funds. Communication developed through letters and telephone calls over several months, each exchange reinforcing Quenzele's legitimacy while advancing the business proposition. The agent discussed specific properties in Uruguay, financing arrangements that seemed realistic, and timelines that suggested genuine commercial planning rather than rushed improvisation. Cookers responded enthusiastically, his correspondence revealing eagerness for an opportunity that promised financial expansion and validation of his business acumen. The psychological elements that made him vulnerable became apparent through these exchanges: vanity about his entrepreneurial abilities, desire for recognition from European peers, and confidence that his wartime activities posed no threat 2 decades later. Uruguay offered operational advantages beyond simply hosting the target. The country maintained minimal security services compared to Argentina or Brazil. Diplomatic relations with Israel remained cordial enough to avoid immediate complications, and Montevideo's European expatriate community provided cover for foreign visitors conducting business. The beach house in Carrasco, selected months before the final meeting, sat in a quiet residential neighborhood where unusual activity would attract less attention than locations in the city center. By early February 1965, Cookers had agreed to travel to Montevideo for a final meeting to formalize their partnership, bringing documents and plans for the proposed venture, unaware that the business discussion would never occur. Planning the assassination required assembling resources and personnel while maintaining absolute operational security in a country where Mossad had limited infrastructure. The organization dispatched a team of 3 to 5 operatives to Uruguay during January and early February 1965, each traveling separately under diplomatic or commercial cover that would withstand casual scrutiny. These agents possessed skills spanning surveillance, close combat, document forgery, and operational planning, selected specifically for an assignment that demanded both precision and adaptability. They arrived in Montevideo weeks before the scheduled meeting, establishing patterns of activity that made their presence unremarkable to neighbors and local authorities. Safe house acquisition presented the first major logistical challenge. The property needed isolation sufficient to prevent witnesses during the assassination while remaining accessible enough to avoid suspicion about why anyone would rent it. Carrasco neighborhood offered both requirements: a residential area frequented by tourists and temporary residents where a beach house rental attracted no particular attention. The team secured the property through intermediaries, using cover stories about European businessmen evaluating Uruguayan real estate investments. Furnishing remained minimal, just enough to suggest occupancy without indicating the house's actual purpose. Operational planning addressed multiple contingencies. If Kukurs failed to appear, the operation would abort rather than risk exposure through surveillance that might alert him. If he arrived with companions, agents would improvise responses depending on whether witnesses could be controlled or whether the entire operation required cancellation. If Uruguayan police responded to disturbances during the execution, escape routes had been mapped through back exits leading to predetermined rally points where vehicles waited. Each scenario received attention during planning sessions that consumed days of preparation. The execution method reflected both practical and symbolic considerations. Mossad selected an approach that would leave no doubt about Kukurs' identity or the reasons for his death, avoiding techniques that might be mistaken for robbery or random violence. The decision to leave a detailed note listing his crimes served multiple purposes. It ensured proper identification of the body, communicated Mossad's motives to investigators and media, and sent a message to other Nazi war criminals that distance and time offered no permanent protection. Agents prepared the document in advance, typing accusations on paper that could not be traced to Israeli sources. Equipment brought into Uruguay included weapons selected for reliability rather than sophistication, tools that could be acquired locally or transported without triggering customs alerts. The team avoided complex technical equipment that might malfunction or require specialized knowledge to operate. Everything needed to function under stress with minimal preparation time once Kukurs arrived. Communication with Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv occurred through established intelligence channels, coded messages transmitted via intermediaries that provided updates without revealing operational details over potentially monitored telecommunications. The team operated with significant autonomy, authorized to execute the mission according to their judgment, while maintaining coordination that allowed headquarters to abort if diplomatic or political circumstances changed. The operation had moved beyond the point where cancellation remained practical. Personnel deployed, resources committed, and timing established that made withdrawal more dangerous than proceeding. February 23, 1965. Kukurs arrived at the Carrasco Beach House shortly before noon, maneuvering his rental car into a space along the residential street where neighbors paid minimal attention to unfamiliar vehicles in a neighborhood accustomed to tourists and temporary residents. He gathered documents from the passenger seat, papers outlining the proposed tourism venture that had consumed his attention for weeks, and walked toward the entrance with the confidence of someone expecting a profitable business discussion. Anton Quenzel greeted him at the door, maintaining the persona that had sustained their relationship through months of correspondence and meetings, gesturing Kukurs inside while exchanging pleasantries about his journey from Brazil. The interior appeared unremarkable, furnished sparsely in a manner consistent with temporary rental properties along Uruguay's coast. Quenzel directed Kukurs toward a room where they could review documents, suggesting they discuss financing arrangements and partnership terms. Kukurs followed, apparently noticing nothing unusual about the setting or his host's demeanor. Other Mossad operatives positioned within the house moved into position as Kukurs entered the designated room, blocking exits and preventing any possibility of escape once the execution commenced. The moment of realization, if it occurred, lasted seconds. Mossad agents confronted Kukurs directly, identifying themselves and stating the reason for his presence in the house. Whether he attempted resistance or recognized the futility of opposing multiple trained operatives remains unclear from available accounts. The execution proceeded swiftly, agents employing methods that ensured death while avoiding prolonged struggle that might generate noise attracting neighbors' attention. Kukurs died within minutes of entering the beach house, his body positioned for subsequent placement in a trunk that would facilitate discovery while preventing immediate decomposition. Agents placed the prepared note with the body, a typed document listing his crimes in Latvia and identifying him as the Butcher of Riga. The text detailed specific atrocities, referenced survivor testimony, and explained that he had been executed for war crimes committed between 1941 and 1944. This documentation served multiple functions: confirming the victim's identity for investigators, establishing motive that distinguished the killing from common crime, and communicating to other Nazi fugitives that Israel maintained the capacity and will to pursue war criminals regardless of elapsed time or geographic distance. The body was sealed in a trunk, positioned where discovery would occur within days but not immediately, allowing the Mossad team time to depart Uruguay before authorities launched intensive investigations. Agents cleaned the scene methodically, removing evidence that might reveal operational details while leaving sufficient material to ensure police understood the killing's nature and purpose. They departed the beach house separately, using different routes and schedules that minimized risk of being connected to one another or to the property. Extraction proceeded according to plan, with operatives leaving Uruguay through commercial flights to various South American and European destinations. Cover stories remained intact, their activities in Montevideo appearing consistent with business travelers or tourists concluding visits. None carried weapons or documents connecting them to the assassination, having disposed of such materials before departing the safe house. By evening on February 23rd, the last operative had cleared Uruguayan airspace, the operation complete, and the team dispersed beyond reach of local authorities. Behind them, the beach house in Carrasco stood quiet, its gruesome contents awaiting discovery that would transform the property into an international crime scene and trigger debates about justice, sovereignty, and the moral calculus of extrajudicial execution. Discovery came within days, neighbors reporting suspicious odors emanating from the beach house and prompting police investigation that revealed Kukers's body in the trunk, along with the detailed note explaining his execution. Uruguayan authorities initially treated the case as a murder requiring standard investigative procedures, interviewing neighbors about unfamiliar visitors, examining the property for evidence, and attempting to trace the rental arrangements back to those responsible. The note complicated their efforts, transforming what might have been a straightforward homicide into an international incident involving espionage, war crimes, and diplomatic tensions between Uruguay, Israel, and various European nations with interests in the case. International reactions varied according to national interests and historical perspectives. West Germany, still grappling with its Nazi past and conducting its own war crimes prosecutions, issued statements condemning extrajudicial execution while acknowledging Kukur's documented crimes. Soviet bloc nations seized the opportunity to criticize Israel and Western powers, portraying the assassination as evidence of Zionist aggression and disregard for international law. Latin American countries expressed concern about foreign intelligence services operating on their territory without authorization, viewing the operation as a sovereignty violation regardless of the victim's background. Israel maintained official silence, neither confirming nor denying involvement in an operation that bore clear hallmarks of Mossad tradecraft. This non-response strategy reflected standard practice for covert actions, avoiding statements that might expose operational methods or create legal complications for future operations. Jewish organizations divided in their reactions, some celebrating the execution as appropriate justice for a mass murderer, others worrying that vigilante killings undermined the rule of law and damaged Israel's international standing. Uruguay's investigation concluded without arrests or charges, authorities acknowledging that the perpetrators had departed the country and that pursuing an international manhunt for Israeli agents served no practical purpose. Intelligence agencies across Western and Soviet blocs analyzed the Kukers assassination with professional interest, examining tradecraft elements that revealed evolving Mossad doctrine and capabilities. The Anton Quenzla legend demonstrated sophisticated identity construction, built with sufficient depth to withstand months of interaction with a target possessing intelligence about European business practices and contacts who could potentially verify credentials. Creating cover identities that survived extended scrutiny required coordinating false documentation across multiple jurisdictions, establishing banking relationships that appeared genuine, and selecting agents capable of maintaining personas under pressure without revealing inconsistencies that might trigger suspicion. Mossad had invested considerable resources in building an identity robust enough for long-term deployment rather than brief operational windows. Operational security throughout the mission reflected careful planning and discipline. The team operated in Uruguay for weeks without attracting attention from local security services or creating patterns that might alert Kukers to surveillance. Communications between operatives and Tel Aviv headquarters avoided compromising channels, relying on coded messages passed through intermediaries rather than direct contact that could be intercepted or traced. Each team member maintained separate cover stories and avoided behaviors that might connect them to one another or to the beach house where the assassination would occur. This compartmentalization ensured that if one operative faced questioning, they could not compromise others regardless of pressure applied by investigators. The safe house selection balanced competing requirements effectively. Carrasco neighborhood provided sufficient isolation to prevent witnesses during the execution while remaining accessible enough that renting property there attracted no particular attention from authorities or residents. The location offered escape routes through multiple streets, avoiding dead ends that might trap operatives if police responded during the operation. Proximity to Montevideo's international airport facilitated rapid extraction once the mission concluded, minimizing time operatives spent in Uruguay after the killing, when investigative pressure would intensify. Execution method choice reflected both practical necessity and symbolic messaging. Mossad selected techniques that ensured death without requiring prolonged struggle that might generate noise, alerting neighbors, prioritizing operational security over elaborate revenge scenarios. The decision to leave a detailed note transformed the killing from anonymous murder into documented execution, ensuring investigators and media understood the victim's identity and the reasons for his death. This strategic communication served multiple audiences. It informed Uruguayan authorities that they were dealing with a targeted assassination rather than random violence. It conveyed to other Nazi war criminals that geographic distance offered no permanent protection, and it demonstrated to Holocaust survivors and the broader Jewish community that Israel maintained commitment to pursuing war criminals decades after their crimes. The Eichmann operation, conducted 5 years earlier, provided instructive comparison. That mission had prioritized capture over elimination, requiring significantly more complex logistics to transport a prisoner across international borders while maintaining custody during extended periods before trial. Eichmann's eventual prosecution in Jerusalem served educational purposes, exposing Holocaust details to global audiences and establishing legal precedent for prosecuting genocide. Yet the operation had triggered intense diplomatic backlash from Argentina, strained Israel's international relationships, and consumed resources that might otherwise support security operations against contemporary threats. The Kukers assassination avoided these complications through a model that achieved permanent removal without requiring prisoner transport, months of detention, or public trials that diverted attention from other intelligence priorities. Vulnerabilities in the operation remained apparent despite its success. If Kukurs had grown suspicious during the months of cultivation and declined the final meeting, Mossad would have lost its opportunity without gaining anything beyond wasted resources and a burned cover identity. If Uruguayan security services had monitored European expatriate communities more carefully, they might have detected the team's presence and intervened before the assassination. If neighbors had investigated suspicious activity at the beach house during the execution rather than days later, operatives might have faced immediate response requiring violent extraction. Each of these scenarios represented potential failure points that careful planning had mitigated but not eliminated entirely. The operation demonstrated capabilities that extended beyond Nazi hunting into broader intelligence operations. Mossad had proved it could deploy teams to neutral countries, maintain deep cover identities over extended periods, execute high-value targets without immediate exposure, and extract personnel before investigations could identify them. These competencies would define Israeli intelligence operations for decades, applied not just to war criminals, but to Palestinian terrorist leaders, hostile nation scientists, and other targets Israel deemed threats to its security. The Kukurs assassination established precedent for extrajudicial execution of war criminals and influenced debates about justice, sovereignty, and accountability that extended far beyond the immediate case. Nazi fugitives living in South America faced new psychological pressure, understanding that comfortable exile no longer guaranteed safety from Israeli retribution. Reports emerged of war criminals altering routines, avoiding European expatriate gatherings where Mossad might plant operatives, and in some cases relocating to countries they perceived as offering better protection from Israeli intelligence. This behavioral change, while difficult to quantify precisely, suggested that the assassination achieved deterrent effects beyond simply eliminating one individual. Subsequent Mossad operations targeting Nazis remained limited, reflecting both the declining number of viable targets as war criminals aged and died naturally, and Israel's shifting intelligence priorities toward contemporary security threats. Palestinian terrorism, Arab military capabilities, and nuclear proliferation in hostile nations demanded resources that might otherwise pursue aging war criminals whose operational significance diminished with each passing year. Yet the willingness to execute rather than capture when circumstances warranted remained embedded in Mossad doctrine, applied selectively to targets deemed unsuitable for public trial or too difficult to extract alive. International legal debates triggered by the assassination centered on competing principles of justice and sovereignty. Traditional legal frameworks held that only courts could impose death sentences following trials that afforded defendants due process protections. Israel's apparent willingness to bypass these procedures challenged fundamental assumptions about how civilized nations should pursue justice, even against individuals whose crimes were well documented. Defenders argued that conventional legal channels had failed systematically, with countries refusing extradition and war criminals dying peacefully while survivors lived with trauma and loss. This failure, they contended, justified alternative approaches when formal justice proved impossible. The comparison between Eichmann's trial and Kukur's execution highlighted different models for addressing Nazi crimes. Eichmann's prosecution had generated extensive documentation, provided survivors opportunities to testify publicly, and educated global audiences about Holocaust details. His trial represented justice operating through transparent legal process, establishing precedents for international criminal law. Yet capturing and trying Eichmann had required enormous resources, triggered diplomatic crises, and taken years from initial operation to final execution following legal appeals. Kukur's assassination achieved permanent removal swiftly, demonstrated Israeli resolve without extended legal proceedings and avoided diplomatic complications that prolonged trials might generate. Academic and legal experts examined whether extrajudicial execution served justice or undermined it. Some argued that killing war criminals without trials denied victims the vindication of public proceedings where crimes would be documented and condemned through formal legal process. Others contended that symbolic victories mattered less than practical outcomes, that eliminating murderers who had evaded prosecution for decades served justice more effectively than allowing them comfortable retirements while pursuing futile legal channels. These philosophical divisions persisted for decades, with no consensus emerging about whether Israel's approach represented admirable pragmatism or dangerous vigilantism. Nazi hunting efforts gradually declined as targets died, and new generations focused on preventing future genocides rather than punishing past ones. Documentation centers continued collecting testimony and evidence, but operational missions became rare. The Kukurs assassination marked a transitional moment when Israel signaled that some targets warranted execution regardless of international legal norms, establishing doctrine that would influence counterterrorism operations and targeted killings for decades to come. Within Israeli intelligence circles, the operation became studied as successful execution of an authorized assassination, demonstrating capabilities for eliminating high-value targets when capture proved impossible or strategically undesirable. Competencies that extended far beyond Nazi hunting into broader security operations against contemporary threats. The Mossad operatives who executed Kukurs returned to Israel without facing prosecution, their identities remaining classified for decades while they resumed regular intelligence assignments or retired into comfortable anonymity. Uruguay never seriously pursued criminal charges against unknown foreign agents who had already departed the country, and Israel maintained its policy of neither confirming nor denying involvement in covert operations. Decades later, some details emerged through investigative journalism and declassified documents, but the specific individuals who planned and executed the assassination remained largely unknown to the public. Kukurs' family in Uruguay faced immediate scrutiny from investigators seeking information about his activities and associations. His wife maintained that he had been a patriotic Latvian defending his country against Soviet communism, rejecting accusations of war crimes as propaganda fabricated by enemies seeking revenge. This defense found limited sympathy among investigators who examined survivor testimony documenting his direct participation in mass killings. The family eventually returned to private life, avoiding public discussion of the assassination or the crimes that precipitated it. His historical legacy remained contested, particularly in Latvia, where post-Soviet independence triggered debates about wartime collaboration and resistance. Some Latvians continued celebrating his pre-war aviation achievements, viewing him as a national hero whose wartime activities deserved different interpretation than Holocaust survivors provided. Others condemned him as a mass murderer whose crimes overshadowed any earlier accomplishments. This division reflected broader struggles throughout Eastern Europe over how nations confront complicity in genocide. Whether individuals who participated in Nazi atrocities deserve condemnation or more nuanced assessment that acknowledges complex wartime circumstances. Herbert's Kukurs remained a contested figure in Latvian memory, celebrated by some as a patriotic aviator, and condemned by others as a war criminal whose death came decades too late. The debate itself reflecting unresolved questions about collaboration, accountability, and how nations remember their darkest chapters. The assassination of Herbert's Kukurs represented more than just the elimination of a single war criminal. It demonstrated that some crimes transcended traditional legal frameworks, that nations might pursue justice through methods challenging conventional sovereignty and international law. The operation revealed Mossad's capacity for conducting complex assassinations in neutral countries, maintaining deep cover identities over extended periods, and executing targets without triggering immediate exposure. These capabilities, refined through Nazi hunting operations, would define Israeli intelligence doctrine for decades, applied to Palestinian terrorist leaders, hostile scientists, and others deemed threats requiring elimination rather than capture. The choice between trial and execution, between transparency and shadow operations, between legal process and operational efficiency, remained unresolved, reflecting fundamental tensions about how democracies should respond when conventional justice systems fail to address documented atrocities. Thank you for watching this story until the end. The assassination of Herbert's Cougars remains one of the most controversial intelligence operations in history, proving that sometimes justice operates outside courtrooms, in the shadows, where nations pursue accountability through methods that challenge traditional legal frameworks. If you found this story captivating, please share it with others who appreciate untold history. Subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the hidden operations that shaped our world. Your support helps us bring these remarkable stories to light. Until next time, stay curious,